Science contains within itself this necessity of externalizing the form of the notion, and it contains the passage of the notion into consciousness. For the self-knowing spirit, just because it grasps its notion as the immediate identity with itself, which in its difference is the certainty of immediacy or sense consciousness, the beginning from which we started. This release of itself from the form of itself is the supreme freedom and assurance of its self-knowledge. In this short paragraph, number 806, what we're seeing is a consolidation, very, very close to the end of the Phenomenology of Spirit, of what has been going on in the absolute knowing section up to this point. And there are a few things that I want to point out before we jump right into a sequential reading of the passage. One is that you notice Hegel is going to talk about sense consciousness, how it's translated here. Is that the same thing as the very, very beginning of the consciousness section, where we're just seeing the raw object, so to speak, and then we go through and start to examine it? I don't think so, even though he does talk about a beginning, an Anfang. I think we should read this through as sort of sensuous consciousness. Sinnliche Bewusstsein is the German here. So consciousness that is working through the medium, but perhaps not completely restricted to the medium that it's working with, that is of the senses, right? So there's an opening, but also a reduction going on. So let's hold that for a moment. The other thing is that he talks about a release, an Entlassen of itself, seine, from the form of itself, seine selbst, right? And we can ask ourselves, well, what is the referent here, right? This release of itself from the form of itself, he tells us, is supreme freedom and assurance of its self-knowledge, and we'll get to that. So we have a couple different candidates, right? The passage begins by talking about science, Wissenschaft, and we have the notion coming up over and over again, or the concept, the Begriff, and then we have self-knowing spirit, and then we have sense consciousness, which is the actual itself in this case. I think the best candidate is actually self-knowing spirit, because that is carrying through this and connected to knowledge, knowing itself, right? And ultimately in the form of science, which is what we're trying to transition to. But, let's come back to that in just a moment. Let's begin here now at the beginning. So he invokes science, which he's referenced several times, Wissenschaft, right? Not merely a phenomenological approach to things, but something that is in some ways more robust, as we saw in the previous paragraph, right? So he says science contains within itself. So, enthält, it includes in itself, in sich, several different things. And one of these is a necessity, a Notwendigkeit. This is going to be important when we look at the next paragraph, where instead of talking about necessity, we see contingency coming up. A necessity of what? Of the form of the notion, the Begriff, the concept, however we want to translate Begriff, externalizing, entäußern, right? Itself. This is a constant theme throughout here. Alienating is another way this is sometimes translated. Externalizing the form of the notion, right? But it also contains a passage, an Übergang, a going over, literally. Sometimes Übergang means something like a thing disappearing or transmuting into something else. In this case, is the notion going away? No, but there is a passage, a movement, to use a term that Hegel's been using over and over again, of the notion, the Begriff, into consciousness, Bewusstsein, right? So, in this particular paragraph, it's just consciousness, it's not self-consciousness that is being brought up. But of course, given all that's past, I think we have to read that in, especially since we're talking about self-knowing spirit, right? And there's all of these selves involved in this, right? A release from the form of itself. So the consciousness, yes, it is consciousness, but also self-consciousness at the same time, which is being reconciled with consciousness. So science contains these two moments within itself, a necessity of the form of the notion externalizing itself, and a passage of the notion into consciousness. Are these radically distinct from each other? They're going hand in hand, right? The externalization and the passage both are bearing on the notion, and so externalizing itself for consciousness. All right, so far, so good. Then he goes on and he says, for the self-knowing spirit, right, the Geist that knows, Wissende, itself, just because it grasps its notion. So it now is at the point where it understands, or it conceptualizes its concept, you could say. So the notion is showing up here quite a bit. Now, this is its notion, but its notion is, as we've seen, we could think about this a little bit, going back to the previous paragraph where we saw this parallelism between what's happening from a phenomenological point of view running throughout the entire phenomenology into absolute knowing, and what is happening in science, in Wissenschaft. Science works with notions, and the notion of the self-knowing spirit, right, we could say is actually a stage, right, or a shape of consciousness. What shape of consciousness? Absolute knowing. The section we're in, the final shape, right? So that is the form that spirit is taking on right now. And he tells us a few things about this. So he tells us the self-knowing spirit is the immediate, unmittelbar, identity, Gleichheit with itself, which in its difference. Now, isn't it interesting to see this? So two different terms that I've brought up a lot already, right? So we need to be careful with these. Gleichheit, identity works, equivalence. Maybe if we want to think about it a little bit more dynamically in terms of the Gleichen rather than merely Gleichheit, the sort of identifying or becoming identical with, we're going to talk about becoming in the next paragraph as well. So maybe there's something to that. So Gleichheit doesn't just mean identity like equals, but it can mean something a little bit more robust. And then difference, Unterschied, right? Literally things being separated from each other. So even in an immediate identity, there's also a difference here. Difference of what? So he says, in its difference, it is the certainty of immediacy, the Bewusstheit of unmittelbar, the immediate, right? Or sense consciousness, the beginning from which we started. I mean, it would be tempting, again, to say, all right, we're all the way back here at the very beginning, not even the introduction or the preface, but sense certainty, right? We just mentioned that. But again, I think we have to read this a bit broader. We're not just, we're not just going around in a circle, right? People are often attracted to that, but it's more like a spiral for Hegel. We ascend that way. So we get sense consciousness, right? What does that lead us to? This final sentence here. this release of itself from the form of itself is what? Supreme freedom. So, Freiheit. Okay, that's important. Necessity and freedom here are being reconciled. And assurance, Sicherheit. So, freedom is good. Sicherheit is even better in a certain respect because it means we hold on to what we've actually achieved through all this dialectical process. And we're going to see that really being consolidated in the final paragraph, less so in this paragraph 807 that follows. But he says the supreme freedom and assurance of its self-knowledge, of its knowledge of what it is in relation to not only itself as consciousness, but self-consciousness, the rest of the other self-consciousnesses, but now in the form of science. Yet, this externalization is still incomplete. It expresses the connection of its self-certainty with the object which, just because it is thus connected, has not yet won its complete freedom. The self-knowing spirit knows not only itself, but also the negative of itself, or its limit. To know one's limit is to know how to sacrifice oneself. This sacrifice is the externalization in which spirit displays the process of its becoming spirit in the form of free, contingent happening, intuiting its pure self as time outside of it, and equally its being as space. This last becoming of spirit, nature, is its living, immediate becoming. Nature, the externalized spirit, is in its existence nothing but this eternal externalization of its continuing existence and the movement which reinstates the subject. In paragraph 807, we reach the penultimate paragraph of this entire absolute knowing section, and because that is the last section of the Phenomenology of Spirit, we are at the second to last paragraph of the entire work. And, the first couple times that you read it, you might feel a little bit of a letdown, in part because, it's full of Hegel jargon, what's going on here. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But also because it seems like we're not really getting at what we wanted in the end, which is this sort of like vision of the totality in a conceptual medium, bringing the entire phenomenology to a close, preparing the way to move into the realm of science. It seems almost as if we're taking a detour, unless you look at the very last sentence of this, which we'll talk about. But notice how it begins. This externalization, Entäußerung, is still incomplete. It hasn't been brought to its fruition, unvollendet, right? And you might say, well, that's okay, we still have one paragraph left. Well, there better be an awful lot happening in that final paragraph if this externalization is not yet completed. And he says, it expresses the connection, the Beziehung, right, of its self-certainty, Selbstbewusstheit, with the object, which, just because it is thus connected, has not yet won its complete freedom. And what hasn't won its complete freedom? The object? No. The self-certainty. What sort of self-certainty? The self-certainty of spirit, as we saw in the previous paragraph. And there's going to be an interesting shift on Miller's part in terms of what's actually being said in the German and what he reports in his translation in just a second. But let's think about this. So, connection of self-certainty with the object that it is connected to. So there's a connection bearing on connection, right? And self-certain spirit does have objects. We're going to see these objects are actually mentioned a little bit later on. time, space, and nature. We'll get to that. So then Miller says, the self-knowing spirit knows not only itself, but also the negative of itself, or the limit. Now, does he say the self-knowing spirit knows that? No, he actually says das Wissen, right? But that's okay, because what is doing this knowing? What is knowing itself? Self-knowing spirit. Okay, so that's clear enough. Now we get to something really interesting. So it knows the negative of itself. This is the object that it's knowing. The limit, the Grenze, the border, we could say, the space after which it's something else. Now, if you've read the science of logic, or at least the very beginnings of it, you know that Hegel plays around with this notion of limit. And there's kind of a paradoxical framing in this, insofar as whatever you want to call it, consciousness, spirit, can conceive of a limit. It's already in a certain way beyond that limit. Really, in Wirklichkeit or Realität, not necessarily, but the mere act of posing this is as far as we can go, already posits something beyond it. And you could say, well, that's because there is something beyond it. Well, how the hell do you know if you haven't crossed that limit? Or maybe it's empty beyond it. Well, how the hell would you know that? Right? Hegel is actually onto something quite deep here that he's just gesturing at, not getting into depth in. But there's something really strange happening in how it actually knows its negative, this limit. How does it know it? Well, Hegel tells us that knowing the limit means knowing how to sacrifice, aufopfern, to make a sacrifice, to make an offering, you could say, of itself. Sacrificing to what? If you think about it, is there some sort of greater eternal truth, capital S, spirit, that our little spirits sacrifice them to? That's a picture of Hegel that we sometimes do get in some works, don't we? Summarizing what Hegel's doing. And sometimes he does talk as if the individual sacrifices himself to the community or the religious point of view or the state or whatever it's going to be. But this is spirit itself. Can spirit sacrifice itself to something else? Maybe it could sacrifice itself to, as we see mentioned, nature. But that would be a step backwards. Because nature, as we're going to see, is kind of a realm that by itself is not meaningful. Right? If we actually wanted to play on the word Sinn, right? Nature is grasped sensuously, right? But it's not grasped as full of Sinn, meaning, except locally, in terms of, desires, impulses, reproduction, that sort of thing. But what we're looking for here is the absolute. So how do we get the absolute? Through self-knowing spirit, knowing its limit, and then knowing how to sacrifice itself. Well, this sacrificing itself, we can understand that in terms of externalization, right? And Äußerung, a term that we've been using a lot. We can also understand it in terms of becoming, werden, which is going to be important in the second half of this paragraph and in the start of the final paragraph, where Hegel is going to introduce a different, additional, more important werden, or becoming, right? So what we're getting here is becoming, a process of transformation, right? So he says the sacrifice is the externalization in which spirit displays the process of becoming spirit. It's becoming spirit. But how? Well, in the form of free, contingent happening. So frei, right? That's good. And we saw that it was referenced just in the previous paragraph, Freiheit, freedom. Contingent, zufällige. Okay, well that's not great here, right? The contingent, the just happens to be the case. Where's the necessity? Where's the Notwendigkeit that we were seeing just a little bit earlier reference, that we've been, seeing drive this entire process and unfolding of necessity? This seems to be a problem. Spirit becoming spirit in the form of free contingent, and then this kind of consolidates it. Happening, geschehens, things that just, wind up being the case. And what we're missing here to look ahead is the dimension of Geschichte, history, not just geschehen, the things that happen to be the case, that turn out this way or that way. So following this out, right, we can say, it's tempting actually when you read this passage again to say, there's three different werdens going on, three different becomings. But really, two of them are, I would say, subsumed under what appears to be the third, which is encompassing them. And, well, I'll hold on to that until we get to the very end of this development. So he says, it intuits its pure self as time outside of it. So its self, what is the self here? The self of spirit that has externalized itself. So we can see this as the self-consciousness of everyone who's managed to follow along up to this point. It externalizes itself as time. Time is something that we are in, but it can also be understood as something that lies outside of the self itself, right? And notice that he uses the word pure, reine, right? The pure self, not the individual self, not the messy self of somebody existing in history, formed by their society, reacting within those dimensions. But you could read this as the transcendental ego, couldn't you? So there's that side, self as time, pure self as time. And then pure being, sein, as space, Raum. Space and time, this suggests to us, again, what we just saw in the previous paragraph, sensible consciousness, sinnliche Bewusstsein. We exist in space and time. We exist through space and time. Space and time are objects for us, but also not just objects, but rather we could say the condition for the possibility of having objects. Yes, there's other stuff as well, but you better have those, as Kant called them, forms of intuition, or else you got nowhere to put objects, know when to, right? And then Hegel goes on and he talks about nature. He says, this last becoming of spirit, nature, is its living immediate becoming, right? So life, as we saw. Now, this is interesting because if we are tempted to go back to the consciousness section to sense certainty with these two, life, where does life first enter in? Other than, like looking at a tree, but not looking at a tree as a living object. In the self-consciousness section. That's where Hegel begins the self-consciousness section. And we do have a few places where we have kind of a reversion. Think about the spiritual animal kingdom where we have this, very impressive panoply of different kinds of life, right? Well, so nature is living, and it's an immediate, when Mittelbares, becoming, werden. And then he tells us two things about this. Nature, the externalized spirit, right? So nature, here's what I was going to say before, nature is perhaps the limit that we're talking about here. Spirit knowing itself in relation to its limit, that it externalizes itself, and nature is, nature's where spirit exists in its actual virkliche form, doesn't it? I mean, human beings are spirit. Is spirit reducible to nature? We're going to see no. But it's not radically sundered from it. Nature, the externalized spirit, he says, is in its existence nothing but this ewige, externalization of its continuing existence. Now, continuing existence there is a translating bestehen, a particular modality of being, we could say. And it's also, he says, a movement that reinstates, herstellt, places there, the subject. Who's the subject? Again, self-knowing spirit. Us, the phenomenologists following along. So nature can be understood in two complementary ways. One way is that it's just this eternal externalization of this continuing existence. That is like a circle, right? Just keeps on happening. And what happens is, you could say it has local meaning, but it doesn't have any lasting or global meaning, right? But nature brings forth the subject. There's an opening in nature for what has externalized itself through nature, but isn't reducible to nature. And this is going to lead us into the final paragraph, where we see in the very first line, Hegel brings up history. And so this is a good place to close off these reflections, to take a little pause before we jump right into that massive, final, hopefully bringing it all together. It actually does, I can tell you, but perhaps you don't know that, paragraph of the Phenomenology of Spirit.